we have no problem with a sovereign Lebanon, and we don't want to return to the days of Syria's occupation over Lebanon, because, as many people have argued, and I think convincingly, that the occupation of Lebanon militarily by Syria was not only bad for the Lebanese, but it was also bad for a number of Syrians, if not most. But what we would like is something politically acceptable. So we rolled out of the summer of 2008, and President Obama was elected, and his position was to engage with Damascus as well as Tehran during the campaign. And there was a decision by the incoming administration that it would indeed engage with Syria, but that also it would not come at Lebanon's expense. And I think the reason for this wasn't just because of our ties with allies in Lebanon, but also because a Hezbollah victory at the polls in the June 2009 elections would be a loss for the United States as well as its allies in Lebanon and the region. Leading up to that election, as part of engagement with the United States, Syrian officials said, publicly and privately, that the elections were up to Lebanese to decide. But behind the scenes, I think that it's we can't say that Syria made a principled decision to keep its hands off of Lebanon. Like in 2000 and 2005, Syria ran a very active campaign in Lebanon, and there were attempts to influence and many times intimidate candidates in Zahle, Betroun, and in Beirut. There were also, and a number of candidates also pointed to fake bombs that were found in candidates' trunks of cars and so on. And although I realize that we can't attribute every bomb in Lebanon to Syria because it's an open environment. But we do know that in Lebanon, where direct Syrian influence is the strongest, and that's in the north, tens of millions of dollars flowed in, and they were largely administered by Colonel Hafiz Makhlouf, who is a senior official in Syrian General Intelligence Directorate, and he's the cousin of Bashar al-Assad. And he's actually designated in an executive order dealing with Lebanon, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Nevertheless, March 14th pulled out a victory by a slightly bigger majority, I guess, than many expected, and a number of Syrian-backed candidates fared rather poorly. This led to a brief period of time in Washington of I would say, cautious optimism regarding engaging Syria, especially concerning Lebanon. Some said that the lack of bloodshed during the poll was a sign of Syrian goodwill towards their neighbors, and that Damascus indeed wanted a new relationship between equals. Others argued that the United States should not reward countries for not killing people, which I guess was called in Washington reverse blackmail. Anyways, what this did is that it led to a very active debate in policy circles in the U.S. government. And the active debate immediately was over Executive Order 13441. We all have heard a lot about Syrian sanctions over the last year. There are two very important executive orders which underpin the entire sanctions regime. One is Executive Order 13338, which regards Syria's behavior in a number of different areas. The other one is 13441, and that involves Syrian behavior in Lebanon. And these have to be renewed every year because actually these executive orders declare a American national emergency regarding Syria's behavior. So there was a very active debate in policy circles saying, hey, Syria is behaving better in Lebanon. The elections came off without a hitch. It's time to drop this executive order. In the end, there was a very active debate. In the end, the executive order was renewed. The national emergency was renewed, but with much kinder language, watered-down language on behalf of the United States, not in terms of the substance of the law, but in terms of the rationale for the law. And it was renewed by President Obama on July 31st. It's during this period of time that there were signs of trouble, and they started out small and led to something bigger. The Syrian embassy, which I think very importantly Mona pointed out, the Syrian embassy in Beirut, which had been established and indeed was a sign of progress between the two countries, was having a hard time functioning. the ambassador was often not there. A number of my journalist friends who would seek visas from the Syrian embassy in Beirut simply couldn't find anyone to communicate with. And I think there are probably some of you in the audience who share my concerns on this, and got in the way of reporting on Syria, which Ambassador Wilcox talked about earlier. And instead, it began a number of traditionally pro-Syrian individuals in Syria, in Lebanon, most notably Wahab, began delivering messages instead of the Syrian embassy. That didn't mean that you didn't have messages coming out of Damascus, but there were other messages being delivered by Wahab, and Lebanese were reading this as a sign of the sort of back to the future that which Mona talked about, in the old days when Syria communicated via its allies. Then, as government formation dragged on throughout the summer and autumn, Syria began to pursue a more aggressive policy, and I'm not necessarily talking here in terms of, well, it centered around backing Hezbollah's demand to reinstitute the 2008 Doha Accord in a different form, where a blocking, or as the Syrians call it, guaranteeing third of deputies would be regularized as part of any government formation. And there was extreme tension, especially last fall, over this, and I was in Lebanon at that time, and it was very difficult to get any Lebanese politicians to really talk about this, especially the one that mattered, and that was Saad Hariri. It was during this time that the March 14th coalition began to crack. There were signs of there were cracks appearing earlier. I know there are a lot of explanations about this, and Mona went into a number of them as well. I think it's a combination of internal differences, as well as a lack of a clear vision from the United States over its policy, and also a complete lack of communication strategy on behalf of the United States, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But it was into this sort of stew that Syria and Iran entered and looked to further their influence in Lebanon. And I think they've done so quite successfully. But for the Zu'ama, the political leaders in Lebanon, I think more important, as Mona discussed, was Saudi engagement with Damascus, as well as combined with the role of France and its engagement efforts with the Assad regime. When the government in Lebanon was eventually formed, Hezbollah's veto power over what was technically a March 14th government was ensured. This outcome, plus the way Damascus perceives the visit by multiple suitors, fed what is now called Syrian triumphalism, which in fact has been brewing for well over 2 years, and in many ways is the reason why I'm in front of you here today. It's easy to see such sentiments as the natural result of the previous 5 years, where Damascus was treated as a pariah, not just by the United States, but many European countries as well. And this is, I think, where Mona was quite aptly talking about Syria's phoenix and its rise from the ashes. But for as distasteful as this triumphalism was, and especially was distasteful to those of us who were on the ground, what was unexpected, well, it wasn't completely unexpected to those of us who were visiting Syria at the time, because there was a clear gap between Syrian expectations and what the United States and oftentimes the international community could deliver. And what was unexpected, though, was that Syria would rapidly boost arms shipments to Hezbollah while pressuring the U.S. to bring Israel to the peace table. The first concerned shipments of short-range arms last year and especially last fall.